am Nsenga Burton, founder and editor-in-chief of the award-winning news blog, The Burton Wire, which covers news of the African diaspora. Today we are so happy because we are going to have a great conversation with the illustrious Mr. Lawrence Hill, author of the novel, The Book of Negroes. And actually that's not the original name of it, but we'll talk about that during the course of the conversation, which later became a mini-series on BET, which I'm sure you all saw, starring Aunjanue Ellis and Lyric Bent in the leading roles. We also have with us Antonio David Lyons, yes, who is one of the characters, Happy Jack, on the show, in the miniseries as well, and is an actor. He's an artivist. He's also a singer, performer. He's really transatlantic, and you know, it's really funny because both of these two people really satisfy our demographic, as well as my next person, Chetachi Egwu, Dr. Chetachi Egwu, who is a columnist for the Burton Wire, as well as our Google Hangout producer. So without further ado, let's get this started and talk about this fantastic novel that became a miniseries, a much heralded miniseries with, I mean, super strong performances. Let's get into the conversation.
Absolutely. So, again, I'm Chetachi Egwu. I want to let everybody out there know, if you happen to be watching us via YouTube, because we are live, that you might have questions for our guest, and we welcome them. All you have to do is tweet us on Twitter. Use @TheBurtonWire to tweet in your questions. You can also ask at the bottom of the YouTube video, and we will get back to you. But we welcome your questions and your participation. And so let me start it off, and I kind of want to know, let me start with you, Lawrence, about the most challenging thing about writing the novel. First of all, tell us the original title of the novel, and then talk about the process of writing it and what the most difficult thing was.
Well, the original title of the novel is The Book of Negroes, and for some years it was published in the States as Someone Knows My Name, although now with the miniseries out, it's been reissued by W.W. Norton as The Book of Negroes in the States as well. So it's finally available in the States under the original title, The Book of Negroes. I'd say the most difficult thing in writing the novel was the first 100 pages, to write the story about a girl ripped from her family, seeing her parents murdered, abducted. Really, I think the only thing you could liken the transatlantic abductions of the 18th century to what might be interplanetary abduction in the 21st century. I mean, Aminata is truly brought to another planet, another world that she could never possibly have imagined or understood or fathomed before she's stolen from her village. So her pain, her losses as a child were by far, you know, the hardest to write. And I had to sort of find various techniques, literary and emotional, to sort of survive that process and keep writing, and to make it tolerable, you know, and engaging for me, but also hopefully for the reader.
Okay, so how did you decide to make the protagonist a woman? You know, that's really rare when we think about these narratives that discuss the transatlantic slave trade, or slavery in general, or Black Power, any of those type of social and cultural and political movements. Rarely is there a female protagonist. What was it that made you just make that decision?
Well, I think that one of the most interesting decisions in writing, in creating drama, is asking whose point of view is going to be privileged, who's going to tell the story, who will be the narrator, and you want to choose somebody who has a great deal to lose, who will be profoundly invested in the story, so the reader can feel the potential of that loss. And naturally, men had a great deal to lose too during the transatlantic slave trade. But I just imagined a woman whose job would be to catch other women's babies, who'd make her living and her livelihood and prove her usefulness in many ways by catching women's babies, being a midwife, at the same time that she loses her own. And so, of course, men weren't catching babies in the 18th century, and it seemed like a woman's story was the story I wanted to tell. I never really stopped and asked myself, do I want to write a story about a boy or a man? It would have been equally difficult. I don't know that writing about a boy or a man would have been any easier whatsoever, but it was a woman's story that I wanted to bring to the page. And when I first heard the story of the Black loyalists moving from Nova Scotia to Sierra Leone, I imagined a woman on one of those ships and tried to sort of hang a story on her shoulders.
Okay, thank you.
Fantastic, fantastic. Well, I was glued to the screen the whole time the Book of Negroes was up. First of all, I grew up across the border from Canada, and so I actually got to see it first on CBC. And then later on it came to the States via BET. So I watched it both times, and I was glued to the screen both times. And wondering, for you, both of you actually, did the miniseries meet your expectations? Did it translate to be what you thought it would be?
That's a good question.
Do you want to go with that one, Antonio, first?
Sure, and I would say absolutely. I mean, you never know how a project is going to translate from script to screen. But there was this moment when I just when I went to audition and I read the sides, and I was just like, wow, this is a really interesting character. This is a really interesting world. And then I read the script, and I was just like, oh my God, I haven't seen this before. And if they get this half right, just half right, that this would be an amazing journey. And I hadn't read the novel before, and Lawrence was kind enough to gift me with a copy of the novel when we were working, and I read that novel, and I was completely blown away, like to a point of tears, to feel Amanada's journey and everyone along the way, and so then that loss and also the triumphs that happened, which are extraordinary. But the inkling that I had that there was something really magical and powerful that was happening was just on set, Anjanou Ellis was giving it all, It's a cast of people across the board that were committed to this work. And that was a really beautiful thing to be a part of, And the director as well, Clement Virgo, was also very committed to getting this story right. And Lawrence being there as well, I think that it created this atmosphere of support and being in a moment of history where you feel like that a story is unfolding in a way that it's never unfolded before, and that you're participating in something that's quite beautiful and magical and important.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think the translation of literature. I'm sorry, I just hijacked. I'm sorry, but the question came to me. But the translation of literature to film, how difficult it is to try to figure out, or and I call even though it's a television miniseries, I felt like the Book of Negroes was very cinematic. In terms of its visual style, so that's why I'm referring to it in a filmic way. But the translation from script, from book to script to screen, a lot can get lost in there. But as a viewer, and as someone who's read the material, I would definitely say I felt like still very much connected to it in the same way that I was connected to it with the novel. So I just had to throw that in there. I couldn't hold back.
Hold back. We don't want you to hold back.
Good to hear. Well, I actually had the fortune to be on the set when Antonio was acting Happy Jack, and I really loved those moments because there he is, hanging out with Aminata, giving her a hard time for her African ways and encouraging her to drop that African thing and realize that she's American now, and American she's going to be from that point forward. And it's such an interesting contrast in characters to see them sort of riffing off each other. It was really great to watch them on the set do their thing.
Oh.
So if I could interject, in terms of, it's interesting that you bring that up, Lawrence, that to drop your African ways and you're an American now. How hard was it for you, both of you actually, Antonio first, to drop your 21st century ways and be transported back to an 18th century, early 19th century character, and then Lawrence, how difficult was it for you to drop this facade, to drop the 21st century facade and transport yourself back then to accurately portray the story?
Well, I think the first part was for you, Antonio, if you'd like to take something after.
Well, I went first last time, so I think you go first this time.
Okay, sure.
Yeah.
Well, I didn't really have to drop the 21st century. I'm a 21st century writer, and I tried to impose a 21st century aesthetic on an old tradition. I mean, the novel is written in the tradition of the slave narrative, and the slave narrative is the first form of literature widely published and disseminated by people of African descent, whether it's in America or Canada or the Caribbean. It's a slave narrative that is first widely published. Who am I? They all start the same way. They all unfold the same way. This is my name. This is where I'm from. This is how my people came to be stolen. This is how I came to be owned and how I came to be free. And let me assert my equality to you, dear reader, in this slave narrative. So it's an act of defiance, it's an act of assertion of one's independence and equality and freedom. And so the slave narrative is a really powerful form of literature. And if you want to understand Black literature, African American literature, African Canadian, and others, you really have to go back to the slave narrative. So I read a bunch as a teenager and young man, and then I read a bunch more as I was working on researching the novel. And so I wrote the novel as if it were a slave narrative. Of course it's not. It's a novel. It's a 21st century novel. And but I set it up in the tradition of the slave narrative. So it's told by one person. Aminata holds the point of view from the first sentence to the last without any wavering. And it follows the structure, the chronological, bare bones, immediate, emotional immediacy of the slave narrative. So I didn't really feel I had to abandon who I was as a writer, but to find a way to layer, an 18th century and 19th century tradition with, a 21st century mentality.
And so, in terms of that layering, perspective and voice, can you speak to a little bit, and this is for both of the guests, about the layering of the Black experience in terms of the diaspora? And I think that, the Book of Negroes, the reason it speaks to so many people, because we have that shared history and that shared experience. And even though a lot of times we don't really discuss it outside of, certain circles, artistic circles or academic circles or what have you, that layering and that complexity of our Black identity is really what brings us together. Can you speak on that? Like, what are your thoughts about that?
I think that there's a great way to sort of tie that in with sort of the question that was asked before. And what I found for myself in approaching the material and the character, the continued realization that Black identity is a lived experience, right? That that is not cut off from the continuity of what that is. And in terms of, if you look at sort of the Great Migration from the south of the U.S. sort of post-slavery to the north, in present day you go to Chicago, you go to Detroit and those places, and you find that people still are well-versed in lived experience in very southern rural idioms.
Right.
In terms of how they speak, the way they live, their culture, the things that are really important to them in terms of their everyday lifestyle. And so what I found with approaching this particular character was that you bring all of yourself to the work all the time, right? So first, I approach it very intuitively. It's like, how is this material? What is it saying to me? What's on the page? What's the spirit of what's living there already? And then beginning to build around that in terms of what do I know in terms of historical, philosophical, and sociologically around that particular period. And even ethnographically, in terms of language and accent and ways of being and what was existing in the Carolinas and what was left, from that transatlantic slave trade. Is sort of the way in which I sort of approach the character. And I think that also living in South Africa, I'm in New York now, but I've been in South Africa since 2003 and traveled to other countries on the continent, that there's a way of being that is particularly African, that there is a concentrated Africanness that is housed within culture on continent. And then as it moves away towards the diaspora, whether it's the West Indies and the Caribbean, and my family's from Jamaica and the Bahamas, it gets diluted a bit more, and then to the Americas, it's something else. But the strains of that still exist. And I found myself tapping into all of that in working on this project. And one really interesting thing that I thought was an amazing moment of synergy, it just so happened that where we were shooting in Cape Town was on a farm, right, which is pretty much a plantation-esque kind of space, where there are orchard trees and grapevines, and they have people that come in, black and brown people, who are African people who come to pick those fruit. And while we were shooting, there was harvesting that was happening, right? And dealing with the sort of, the economical realities of South Africa and what that means in terms of pay and living conditions of people working on those farms hit me in the most profound kind of way. So here I am, playing this character that is on a slave plantation, on a plantation of sorts, with people who are working for less than their worth, right? And it was a profound experience that really layered that journey for me. And I don't think I'll ever sort of forget having those real life, real moment connections to what was happening around me as well as the historical connections.
Yes, I have to say that was so moving emotionally to be there and to watch that, and I noticed those things, and I happened to be an extra one night on the set near Cape Town in the same wine farm that Antonio is mentioning, where they're growing grapes and harvesting them to convert to wine. And one of the women I met, in the 6-hour shoot late at night for the wedding scene, when Aminata marries Chikura, it was a young woman refugee who'd arrived in South Africa as a refugee with no papers and maybe $800 to her name. And the only $800 that she owned, she gave to a man who promised to get her a passport. And of course, that was the last she ever saw of that man. And that was one of the last things that she'd experienced before she managed to get this job as an extra on the set in Cape Town. It was just the most amazing thing to spend 6 hours just talking to this woman in her life. She'd been studying medicine in another country before she'd been forced into refuge in South Africa, again without papers. So these migrations and struggles and bitter fights and losses, that we experience with Aminata are playing out right now, even on the set as we film. So it was really quite striking to see. And of course, the scene that I watched over and over that Antonio was filming with Ingenue has to do with the collection of urine that men are basically forced to urinate into a bucket, and this urine collected forcibly from the men, it's Aminata's job to collect it, is poured into a vat where they're sort of provoking it as a chemical catalyst, a liquid that's inducing the creation of indigo, the indigo dye. And so the human urine is used as a kind of a catalyst to provoke that chemical reaction. So the men don't even own their own bodies. They don't even own their own urine. And Aminata's collecting it from Happy Jack and other people. And it was really quite something to watch that scene. It really spoke volumes.
Yeah, that's incredible. The fact that that scene struck me as well. And I think I tuned in. I watched it a couple of times. I tuned in at that part, and it's like, wow, you don't even own your own waste. That
yeah, absolutely.
Yeah. That's incredible. There is something else I wanted to chime in and ask of Antonio, and that was your process for preparing for this role. Was there anything special that you needed to do? I know you're a seasoned actor. You've been in a myriad of things. If you look at your IMDb page, it like goes to screens and screens and screens. And so I was wondering if there was anything differently that you did to prepare for this role than any of the other roles that you may have faced, or what was your process?
I spoke about it a little bit earlier in terms of just sort of the intuitive process, but I think that I didn't know much about the Carolinas. I didn't know much about what does it take to make indigo, or just sort of where we were in terms of timeline historically in this country, in terms of how deep we were into slavery, how close that was to emancipation or not. And the movement of peoples. And so for me, just doing that work, doing that research to understand what I was doing and why I was there. And I think that also trying to really make sense with that particular character about these relationships, right? Because we talk about people owning you and not having agency and control over your own waste, let alone your mind and your body, because there is a scene, I think, which was one of the most difficult scenes for me to be a part of, where Aminata is raped. And there are two parts to that scene that were extraordinarily difficult. One, taking her to be raped, because we knew what was going to happen. And then having to come in that aftermath and take her out of that space. And that was a really challenging space to be in, to prepare for. And for me, it was really about understanding what happens to your children, whether they're your biological children or your community children, when they are sacrificed in that way. And so that was something that was really important for me to sort of prepare for, what does it mean to be a part of a cycle like that?
I'm so interested in the complexity of these emotional relationships. It just plunges me right back into the story. I mean, Antonio as Happy Jack, has to move through that space of, in some vague way, not intentionally, but he's forcibly made to be complicit with this act of violence. But then, of course, he helps her afterward, which is what he really wants to do. And Chikura, Aminata's husband, as a young boy, is forced into the slave trade himself, and he's forced to be a captor and to participate in the capture and the conveyance of Aminata from her village as a pubescent girl in West Africa all the way to the coast, which is about a 600 or 700 mile walk. And so he's haunted by that complicity, even though he loves her and he spends his life, trying to build a life with her. He's haunted by the fact that he was complicit in her abduction and her movement into slavery, even though he was too. And of course, when these characters all show up in New York City, there are some African Americans who side with the rebels and others who side with the British. And I'm very interested in all the nuanced, textured, differentiated relationships between these peoples of African descent. Why should they all think and feel the same way? They don't. They have differences, and they have struggles, and they suffer from guilt and from senses of complicity too, even when it wasn't voluntary. And so these are some of the subtleties emotionally that I'm sure were really challenging for Antonio to play, but also challenging for me to unearth as a writer.
And also the contemporary reverberations of that as well. Like, we still have these expectations of one another to perform blackness or Africanness in a particular kind of way. And those frictions occur within our communities all the time. And that's really something that's powerful to see, that, okay, so this is something that has existed for quite a period of time, and that those are still some of the challenges that we face, or some of the gifts, to be able to recognize that it's not going to all be the same.
And so my grandmother, May Edwards Hill, was born African-American in 1896, born and raised in D.C., and one of the things that she hated when I was growing up in the 1960s and 70s, she hated the musical Porgy and Bess. She just hated it because she couldn't stand seeing Bess and Porgy cavort around like low-class blacks, and she felt it reflected badly on her. She didn't like what she felt to be the dramatization of immoral behavior on the part of black people, and she wanted to stop that because she felt offended by it. She felt it reflected badly on her. She was sort of a middle-class black woman, educated, and the last thing she wanted to do was see Porgy and Bess entertaining American peoples because she felt it insulted the dignity that she worked so hard to create. So, of course, as an artist, I want to be free, but we face a great deal of the same sorts of things today. People want us to create role models, even in the acting that we do or in the characters that we create on the page, and it's hard to be free from that and to be authentic to your own creative drive when you feel the driving pulse and the expectations of your community.
Right, and I was going to ask you about that too. What pushback have you gotten, Lawrence, for being as candid as you are? Because your work is very researched. It's very historical in nature, and so I think it's hard. I know when the series was airing on BET, we were having we being friends having conversations, and some people were like, I just can't watch it. I'm angry. I'm going to burn down a building. There were all types of reactions, like or like even just when you shed, and Antonio does your art to shed light on things that people just don't know about, whether it's the urine, whether it's the rape, whether it's the fact that you could have, kept your word about one thing and then, be taken away anyway, So what pushback have you gotten from people, if any, or, the responses that you've gotten about shedding light on such a brutal thing?
The most interesting pushback, and the most subtle and maybe the most challenging to respond to, has come from African Canadians and African Americans, because of course it's coming from within, and one element of the pushback has been, do we need another story about slavery? Could you please just leave that alone in the closet? Right. Really, we have to go there again. Can't we just write documentary biographies about successful African Americans?
Right.
And so that's a pushback, which I've sort of developed an answer to, or several answers. It's a complex, legitimate question. It deserves a complex and legitimate answer, or many. And another one is that some people are scandalized that I depicted Africans also complicit in the participating in the abduction of African peoples in the slave trade. But the sad truth is that, like it or not, whether we're proud of this or not, Europeans were not traveling deep into the heart of Africa in the 18th century. Europeans were on the coast of Africa. They weren't traveling deep into Africa, and so they bribed, African intermediaries to do their dirty work for them and to bring captives to them on the coast. And we can lament that, but it is true.
Right.
And so there was no way to sort of tell this story and not show, among others, Africans also participating in the abduction of their own people. So that's an element of pushback that I've sometimes had too. Did you really have to go there? Did you have to show that? With all the blame that Europeans and white people have for slavery, why did you have to show Africans also involved? And so those are two of the elements. And of course the third would be the title. Some people are offended by the title of the Book of Negroes. And I'll say quickly that the title derives from a historical document kept by the British Navy recording the exodus of 3,000 African Americans who are leaving New York City and going primarily to Nova Scotia, Canada, at the end of the Revolutionary War. So the title derives from a document that is in the New York Public Library and in the National Archives in D.C. and in other places, and is largely forgotten, but a really vital document, which is central to the story itself.
Right. Thank you.
Wow. So it's interesting that you bring up these points, Lawrence, of people saying, do we have to tell another slave story? Can't we tell uplifting stories? As if these things never happened, and as if there's nothing else to tell about these stories. And there's so much more to tell. So what I want to know from you is how you feel this story, how Book of Negroes differs from other slave narratives that have been told before, both in terms of literary work and in terms of film and television. Where does it build upon those former narratives, and how does it differ?
Well, it differs in many ways. For one thing, it's a woman's story through and through, from the first syllable to the last. It's a woman's story. That's relatively rare. Second of all, it's a transatlantic story. This isn't the story of America or Canada or Africa or England. It's a story of all of these countries and more. It's a transatlantic story. The people in the story, Aminata especially, are engaged throughout their life or her life in a kind of transatlantic milk run, moving from place to place to place across the Atlantic. And also, in all of my readings of fiction and nonfiction about the African American and African Canadian experiences, I had never, until I studied the history underneath this novel, learned that there were about 1,200 African Americans who had been brought from Africa who actually managed to return to Africa in the same lifetime in which they'd been abducted. So this is a back to Africa story that originates finally from the shores of Halifax on the east coast of Canada. After these African Americans have fled New York, they go to Halifax, or Nova Scotia, I should say. So it's a story that's transatlantic. It's a woman's story. It's a back to Africa story, and it's modeled on the slave narrative. And so its internationality, as well as the fact that it's a woman's story, and also it incorporates a history of the losers. We all know about Crispus Attucks, dying for the rebels. It's the first person to die in the American Revolutionary War. But the story of the thousands of African Americans who chose to serve the British in the war is lost, because the British lost the war. The rebels won and created the United States. So the story of those who served the British is swept under the rugs of history because it belongs to the losers. So it is really thematically and historically new material that most North Americans don't know much about.
Right.
Can I add something to that?
Absolutely.
And it may seem very obvious.
Absolutely.
One of the things that I found extraordinary about the story was that we finally got an idea about where people went and what happened to them as they went north, right?
Right.
So what struck me is that I don't know anything. We don't learn very much about sort of what happened to African peoples that went north to Canada and seeking freedom, whether it was via the story that unfolds in the Book of Negroes or whether it's people running away to slavery, right? And that there is this whole population of our shared diaspora ancestors that live in Canada, that have these rich histories, that we're connected. And for the first time, I felt connected in a very real kind of way to Afro-Canadians, the way that I did before. I was like, I knew nothing, and I felt like a complete idiot actually. And I was like, how is it that I know so little, right? And it would be just at University of Michigan, and I think that Tachi can speak to this as well. Like learning about the Underground Railroad that was in Ypsilanti and Ann Arbor, and the island that's just off of Michigan that was a way station as people made their way across the lake to Canada for freedom, you know, and that there are these whole communities just on the other side that are Afro-Canadian populations that I was like, wow, okay, now my mind's open. I'm really interested in finding more about those relationships as well.
Absolutely, because I think we tend to think about Black people in Canada as a more recent thing, Caribbean immigrants, the children of Caribbean immigrants, etc. But we don't realize that it goes farther back. So I think this is why this story is so important and why it resonates with so many people.
I'll just say quickly that African-Canadian history is known to date back to about 1603, 1605, when the first documented Black person is walking on the shores of Canada. He's a free person named Matthew da Costa, who's Black. He's from Portugal. He's an interpreter, interpreting between the Aboriginal Canadians and the French explorers. The first documented slave in Canada dates back to 1628. A young boy from Madagascar, actually, surprisingly, who's about 8 years old. He's a slave in Quebec City. His name is Olivier Lejeune. And so slavery in Canada has a history that goes back pretty well as far as it does in the United States. The primary difference is that it never acquired the economic engine that it did in the States, not because of any moral superiority in Canada, but simply because we didn't have the climate to allow for plantation economies. So slavery was primarily an urban phenomenon in Canada, whereas it was primarily a rural phenomenon in the States.
Interesting. Wow. Fantastic.
Yeah.
Wow.
Well, I think it's time. We've reached our time limit. I mean, Chetachi, do you have anything else, or Mr. Lawrence?
I did want to ask them one question. I always want to know what's next. What's next for you, Lawrence, and what's next for you, Antonio?
Well, go ahead, Antonio.
It's twofold. On this sort of commercial side of my acting career, it is always that eternal thing of where's the next job? So looking for the next job and reading scripts and auditioning and that sort of thing. On the artivist side, I'm really engaged with a project called We're Here, which is a one-man show and a social activism campaign that works with men and boys, African diaspora men and boys in particular, around identity, masculinity, and gender-based violence, allowing for a ripple effect in community as we discover new tools to engage with self and with others. So that's been like a major focus of mine, and that's work that I do in South Africa. We were just doing some of that work at University of Michigan, and now that I'm in New York, we continue to do some more of that work here. And those are the things that keep me busy, keep my heart pumping, keep me creative, keep me excited, and engaged. So that's what's happening.
Well, I can't wait to see more of your work, and also to collude and chat and talk in person, Antonio. That would be great. In my case, I've been working for the last few years on a novel, and this is a contemporary novel about an illegal refugee, and I've always been interested in notions of illegality. And to me, it's profoundly offensive that a human being can be deemed to be illegal in their person. You can do something illegal, like steal a loaf of bread, but how can you be illegal simply because you're standing somewhere where you're not supposed to be, like in a country where you have no papers? And so I'm interested in notions of refugees who are deemed to be illegal. So I've written a novel about a so-called illegal refugee and terrible troubles that he has, and how hard it is to cope with those troubles while he's illegal. And so it's a contemporary novel, and I'm just winding it up now.
Wow.
Wow.
Okay. Well, thank you. Chetachi, thank you so much for producing this. What are you working on, Chetachi? I want to know what you're working on.
Oh, wow, wow. That's a whole other Google Hangout. We actually have a bunch of projects coming up through my collective I work with, Conscious Thought Media. We have a bunch of film projects and television pilots and things that we're trying to write up, working on a couple of screenplays. So I'm just trying to, get it all together and get it all done. Excellent. Additionally, teaching at Nova Southeastern University. So.
Okay. Well, thank you so much. This was a very spirited conversation. Thank you so much, Antonio and Lawrence, for joining us. I really love this conversation because it really reflects the mission of the Burton Wire, which is to bring together people of African descent worldwide and have these very important conversations and to highlight and shed light on the work that our people are doing and making a difference and really just informing and educating and inspiring and entertaining in so many different ways. So I really, really appreciate you taking the time out to meet with us and to talk with us and our viewers. And we look forward to staying in touch and having you on sometime in the future. Thank you for everyone who tuned in, and join us in a couple of weeks for our next Google Hangout, where we will be talking about relationships.
Yes.
We heard we're a little too deep. We heard we're a little too deep and intense, so we're going to do something fun next time. Than slavery next time. So thank you for joining us, and have a great weekend.
Thank you very much.
Thanks, everyone. Bye.
Bye-bye.